From breakthrough devices to the bottom line, we explore the investment trends, the commercial models, and the strategic thinking required to bring neurotechnology to the global market. This is the Business of Neurotech. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Adam Fraser, and today I'm delighted to welcome Matias Serebrinsky, founding partner of PsyMed Ventures, a specialist VC fund investing exclusively in frontier brain and mental health technologies. Matias, you've done some startup stuff. You've worked at NVIDIA, lots to talk about. A big welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. Happy to be here.
Great stuff. We like to talk to founders, analysts, investors. Had a couple of other investors on. One, Amy Cruz, a specialist neurotech investor, and then Richard Mulry just recently talking about investing from inside a hospital system. So interested to get your perspective as really a mental health specialist investor and understand your thoughts on the landscape and the investment market. So yeah, look, please kick things off, Matias. Great to have you on the show. Tell us a bit about your backstory, your time at NVIDIA, and how you ultimately ended up in the world of venture capital.
I started a company in 2013 and quickly fell in love with startups. And so after that experience, which the company did fairly well, I wanted to stay connected with the startup ecosystem and started asking myself, what are other ways? And it felt like instead of being the player, I can be the coach. And a little bit of what being an investor at the earliest stages is that it's an opportunity to have skin in the game, to stay connected, to support entrepreneurs, to help them, and to make something happen that is important for the world. And so that was the impetus for joining NVIDIA, the ventures team at NVIDIA, joining a program that supports very early stage companies in AI. And ultimately, it was also the impetus for studying PsyMed. At PsyMed, as you well said, we invest in frontier neuro. And so for me, this combines two of the things I care the most and I'm the most passionate in life. Startups as this engine of creation, of innovation in the world, and also frontier neuro. I fundamentally believe that this is the defining health problem of our times. And I believe that for many, many years, way before I started PsyMed. What changed in the past few years is that I started to have this belief that it was actually tractable. And so it went from something that I was doing on the side and supporting nonprofits and doing some angel investing to actually deciding to dedicate all my time.
Great. I love the player to coach analogy. It's the first time I've heard that, but makes a lot of sense. I don't want to go down the NVIDIA rabbit hole, but having you on the pod, I have to ask just one question. I think you left around 2018, 2019. They've done quite well since you left. What an astonishing success story. Did you kind of see the early signs of that explosion from the kind of incubation work you were doing?
I left NVIDIA much later in 2021.
Right.
And so the reason I'm saying this is that I actually got to see and be there while things were taking off.
Right.
It was when I first joined in 2017, it was not clear at all. I joined because I fell in love with the technology. I was very much excited about joining a technology engineering first company with this very broad vision of supporting the increasing compute needs that the world would have, right? That was always the vision of NVIDIA since day one. But I had no idea the scale of it. And I had no idea that this killer use case for compute would actually be AI and more specifically transformer-based models or LLMs in the case of what's hot today. So I didn't have that foresight, and I believe that most people there didn't. But I was there when things started to take off. And the reason, or one of the reasons that I was positive that PsyMed Ventures, a fund focused on human health, would be successful is because I had this first row seat at what happened when AI started being deployed in biology. And things like AlphaFold and all of those things that are super exciting were that sort of first indicator that nowhere AI would have a larger impact than in biology. And that was one of the reasons that I had conviction that it's worth starting a fund focused on this.
Yes. No. Great to take the lessons of what you saw in NVIDIA and also reminded to us all an overnight success after decades plowing away in a slightly different sector, then just a subtle pivot and the business takes off. So it must have been an amazing experience. Matias, before we get into neurotech and mental health, just final question on kind of, you're first and foremost, you're a venture capital investor. Before we get into your subject matter domain and expertise, what do you think when you're first looking at investment, what makes a great venture capital investment for you? What are you looking for?
The answer is quite simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. And what we invest is always generational, outstanding founders, right? Top 0.1% founders working on a very large need. Doesn't need to be a very large market yet, but at least a very, very large, important need with orthogonal solutions, right? You gotta have those three things when you're investing super early. And so that's what we look for in the stages where we invest, where usually it's pre-product, right? It's a slide deck, maybe a little bit more. But what we've seen over and over is that these exceptional founders basically bend reality, or at least shorten the time from something that is exciting from a scientific perspective to actually see the light of day as a startup and as a company and as a product.
Yeah. Great stuff. Okay, well, look, let's move into neurotech, mental health. First question may just seem almost academic, but I'm interested. How would you define the neurotech market in terms of addressable market, in terms of subsectors, kind of in your head? Where does it start and where does it stop?
I have a slightly different definition of neurotech than the narrow definition that most people take. Technology is applied science, right? And so I see neurotech as applied neuroscience. And this is very, very large and includes therapeutics and diagnostics and consumer and devices and hopefully the intersection of many of the things I said, of biology and hardware and software, right? So that's one way of thinking about what really is. When you think about the market, right? As of last year, the burden of disease of brain and mental illness has been around $5 trillion. So I think it's almost silly to think about market size. It's just too big, too overwhelming. 1 in 2 Americans will have a brain illness throughout their lifetimes, and so the market is pretty much everyone.
Yeah. It may seem trite, but we've said it a few times on the podcast, there's 8 billion brains in the potential addressable market. There's the problems of the brain, but there's also the potential of the brain. That's everyone. And as you say, there's some big, chunky problems, people like yourself, through investing and some brilliant founders trying to move the needle in this area, particularly mental health. So you touched earlier, Matias, on your seed, your early stage, but just flesh that out a bit. Tell the listeners about PsyMed, your history, the fund, check sizes, how you operate in the market.
Mm-hmm. PsyMed invests in frontier neuro, as we call it, this intersection of brain and mental health. Neuro, as a category, will be one of the largest and defining venture fields of the next few decades, alongside things like space and AI and defense and many other of these, crypto at some point. So we leave neuro for a bunch of reasons that we just mentioned, and many others will be very, very, very large. We invest as early as possible, right? Sometimes pre-product, sometimes even pre-email domain, with just a Gmail. And there are a few reasons for it, right? One of them is that both Greg and I, the two general partners at PsyMed, are entrepreneurs. We went from 0 to 1. So we understand that we can underwrite that founder journey. And that's our value proposition as well, right? Like we can support founders at those very early stages. Typical checks for our investments at pre-seed seed are somewhere between $500,000 to $1 million.
Do you typically follow on? Is the intent to follow on through to A, B, C, and support the journey beyond?
Yeah, that's right. We have different vehicles through which we can support companies, but there are companies that we have invested in every round from pre-seed to Series B.
Yeah. I mean, coming in that early, Matias, however amazing the vision and however capable the founder is, you're well up that risk-return profile. A numbers game, by definition, if you're taking the right amount of risk, a significant number of your investees will not succeed. I guess that's just part of the game. It's part of the area of the market you're operating in.
If we do our job well, what you said is true. So, so if we do our job well, most, or at least, a big percentage of our portfolio companies will not succeed. And that's the game that we're playing. And I believe that is where venture as an asset class is most suited to fund things that are unlikely to work. But if they work, they transform fields, categories, species, and ultimately humanity.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny as you're chatting, I'm thinking obviously very topical is the mega rounds, Anthropic and OpenAI, and many AI companies are raising tens of billions of dollars at multi-hundreds of billions of dollars post-monies, essentially pre-IPO rounds. And we call it all venture capital, but it's a completely different game to what you're playing.
Yeah, that's right. There are different ways of doing venture. There are different categories, different models. The model that we do and focus on are those early stages at companies that still have a lot to figure out. And that is very different than sort of these growth rounds that companies like OpenAI and Anthropic are doing today.
Sure.
But arguably, it's not different than how those companies got started, at least some of them, right? This phenomenon that happens with AI is that the capital needs of these companies is higher than what typically was needed in venture. But it's not unlike what happens in other fields, in biotech, in therapeutics, and even in devices.
Yeah. So you're clearly a big believer in the future potential and importance of neurotech. Clearly, I'm on board as well. Work at Omniscient. We're all attacking, I guess, the same problems from different angles. I referenced earlier in the intro, Amy Cruz from Satori Neuro has been on, specialist neurotech fund. I'm expecting to see more and more specialist funds, migration of capital to neurotech. We're starting to see it with BCI specifically, but still it's, broadly generalist VC funds dipping their toe in through BCI. Is that something, you're another example of a specialist fund in this field, but there's still not that many of you. Are you expecting that to grow, the generalist versus specialist, that neurotech really becomes a distinct investment grade asset class in its own right?
Yes and no. What I mean is that we expect that neuro as a category will keep on growing, right? In the past couple of years, there's been over $65 billion in exits in companies tackling CNS, right? One way or another. We expect this number to keep on growing, and that means that other people will join, will see the opportunity and will join, and that will look a little bit like specialist funds. Arguably, funds like ours and a few others have been building our brand, our infrastructure, more importantly, our network for now, 6+ years. I would argue even 10 years if you include work that we were doing before launching PsyMed. And so these new funds that join may or may not have sort of, as they say in venture, a right to win, right? But there may be other people that are joining us, spinning out of these quintessential companies in BCI like Neuralink, and they may totally have the right to win. So that's one thing. Yes, more specialist funds will get started, but some of us, I would argue, have a leg start in terms of everything that we built over the past few years and even the brand recognition. And then more interestingly, yes, the generalist funds will invest in these fields. They are already doing it, right? Many of the companies that we led investments at pre-seed, seed are now being invested by tier one tech and biotech funds at Series A, B, and so on. And so this should happen as the category gets better understood, and there's more proof that this is a very profitable and investable field.
Yeah. You wrote an excellent blog post, by coincidence, post us starting to talk about you hopping on the pod, and I knew it was an area we'd talk about in July. It was on LinkedIn. I assume it's on the PsyMed website as well, about this Neuro's time has come. It's now becoming investment grade, I guess. You talk about the results of investments. It's a very public game, IRRs, DPI, generally it's known. Is the marquee IPO, whether it's Neuralink, whether it's something else, a couple of big trophy exits, is that really the final thing that's needed? Because to your earlier point, I think everyone can see the scale of the problem. Everyone can see the scale of the TAM. The brilliant science and the brilliant tech is emerging, but it's not quite happening at scale, that maybe we need those big exits or a couple of big IPOs to really cement the status of neurotech.
Yeah, that's right. An example from an adjacent field that we were heavily invested and are heavily invested is psychedelic therapeutics. Back in 2020, we started investing in psychedelics, and this was based out of seeing the data coming from Hopkins and Imperial College of London and Harvard and many other institutions, and seeing that this was just not priced in, and most investors were, for a bunch of different reasons, not really touching these categories, these fields, these companies, right? And fast forward to today, we've had companies that were acquired, at least some of their programs acquired by AbbVie, one of the largest pharma companies in the world. Beckley Atai, another portfolio company, was just acquired by Eli Lilly for up to $3.8 billion. And so my point is that exactly what you just shared, it's already happened in fields like psychedelics. And I think the same is going to happen in other fields like brain-computer interfaces. What is interesting about BCI that is different than psychedelics is that psychedelics ultimately follow the therapeutics playbook. And so you have these natural acquirers for those companies, which are large pharma companies.
Sure.
BCI is different, where you don't have companies that look like pharma companies at that sort of scale in devices. You could think about this as a problem because the exit path, the liquidity path, is not as well understood. But the counter side to that is that some of these BCI companies will grow to the scale of pharma companies. And so you should expect in the next few years, maybe 10 years from now, to have BCI companies, neurotech companies that are standalone companies that kind of are public companies that compete with large pharma companies. And in a way that is less possible in therapeutics because as the therapeutic companies, biotech startups grow, they have these very interesting acquisition efforts from pharma. And so that in a way hinders the potential for these companies to actually become the next large pharma companies.
Yes. So interesting. Matias, last question on the general landscape then. For the second half of the interview, I thought it'd be good to mini deep dive into three of your portfolio companies. But to segue to that, looking at the PsyMed website, and again, I'll put a link in the show notes, it's fascinating the breadth of investments you've done. Obviously, seed, pre-seed, it's more of a numbers game. You have a sort of larger number of small bets, but it's really across the spectrum, hardware, software, digital therapeutics, workflow, AI, you mentioned psychedelics. Just talk a little bit, the subsectors within neurotech. Are you equally comfortable, in all of them? Do you have a thesis that skews more, towards hardware than software or platforms? What's your thinking? A lot must come across your desk. Is there anything you kind of shy away from? And is there anything you prefer to back?
The two heuristics are that we invest in transformational and not incremental technologies, right? It really needs to rethink how we treat disease in one way or another. And then the second one is that they cannot be one-trick ponies.
Right.
And so what this means is that we're very, very interested and usually, biased for platform technologies.
Sure.
With that in mind, as you well described, we have invested in hardware, we have invested in software, and we have invested in wetware. And so any of these areas are fair game for us. We have expertise, and the team has expertise in all these different sort of fields. I would say that we are currently very interested in, and still very interested in, brain-computer interfaces. We have many investments in the field, but believe that there are many future opportunities there. The second big pillar that we're investing in is computational biology, computational neuroscience. The brain is this data-rich, insights-poor organ, and that's a really good a place for AI. With my experience at NVIDIA, obviously this is a field that I'm extremely passionate about. And then the third big area that we're looking at things is in care delivery. And this is fairly new for us. For many years, we mostly shied away from healthcare and care delivery because the margins and the way that these companies scale, it's not that conducive for venture. This is changing. And the main reason this is changing is AI, where some of the things that we're scaling by bringing more employees, by just adding labor with not so interesting marginal profit margins there, are now being scaled by deploying more code, models, AI. And so I believe that care delivery is especially appealing these days. Other things that we're interested in is what you would think as health 2.0. So thinking about care that is predictive, that is preventative, and it's personalized. The 3 Ps, right?
Yes.
And so those things are also very interesting to us.
Great stuff, Matias. So I thought let's shift gears for the final half of the interview. We just spent a few minutes on 3 of your investee companies. It was difficult to choose 3 because there's some that they're all interesting in their own right, and arguably each could justify a podcast in their own right. So we'll have to go sort of light touch on each, but just to give the listeners a spread of subsectors and how you think about them. Now, I couldn't avoid Motif as my first choice. I'm 10 episodes in, Matias, to this podcast. I'm trying not to make this a BCI podcast, but no matter what the guest, we somehow end up BCI, not surprisingly, given Elon Musk and Neuralink and just the sheer volume of capital coming in. But Motif, is an interesting play on BCI, slightly different. The headline readers think everyone's doing the same thing. Far from the case when you look at the hardware software integrations and the material science and the way people are going about it. So just introduce people to Motif and how they're approaching this field.
Yeah. So we started the interview by you asking me what is our criteria for investable companies. And I said this idea of an orthogonal solution, right? Like tackling it in this alternative way. And Motif, if you compare it to other BCI companies, is exactly this. So Motif has a device that is the size of a blueberry that is implanted at the dura level. So it's not really touching the brain. It potentially will be an outpatient procedure. You don't need to go under general anesthesia. And this device, first indication is for treatment-resistant depression, but ultimately it's a platform play that it can be deployed in many different disease areas. What is, to me, very interesting about Motif is that it's ultimately a materials engineering innovation. The way that this stimulator releases energy, right? How it is done from converting electromagnetic energy is something that Jacob, the founder of the company, worked at Rice University for many, many, many years. And so what we were first captivated by was the materials engineering innovation of the device.
So very different to the far more invasive methodologies of a Neuralink or a Paradromics that are going deep into the brain. This sits on the surface of the brain, so penetrating the skull, but not inside the brain.
Yeah, that's right. On the dura level, so not even touching the brain. It's it's touching the dura.
And I guess you're taking that's that kind of trade-off between invasiveness and insight, I guess. We don't know enough to know. It's like the elasticity of demand curve of a product. How deep do you have to go to get what granularity and depth and quality of insight? We probably don't know, but I guess you're taking a view that ultimately to get to scale, talk about friction in any product or any medical procedure. Clearly, human beings would prefer not to have deep brain surgery for a benefit, and you're taking a view that you don't need to be that invasive to get utility, particularly in mental health.
Yeah, it's not a yes or no answer, right? This will be the best solution for certain problems, for certain patients, for certain indications, and it will not be the best solution for others. So I think one mistake that many people do when thinking about BCI is thinking that there will be one winner, one form factor, one company, one technology that will dominate everything. And that would be like thinking that there will be one drug, right, that will be useful for everything. That's not the case. GLP-1s are starting to look like this drug that helps for everything. But in reality, right, this, the BCI field is pretty much the same, where we will have many technologies, and each one of these technologies will be the best solution for, a set of problems. We believe that what Motif is working on will be the winning form factor, as you mentioned, very easy to deploy, very easy to implement, more affordable than potentially other solutions. And so for some things, this will be extremely effective and safe. You said, well, we don't know yet, and that is absolutely true. The interesting thing about how Motif works is that when we were reviewing the company, we learned a lot about transcranial magnetic stimulation. There are a lot of data around TMS being extremely, extremely effective for certain conditions. And so you could think about Motif as a company that is taking what we learned about TMS, the targets, right, the parameters, the stimulation sort of protocols, and saying, hey, how can we do this in a way that is a lot more convenient for everyone in the ecosystem, for patients, for payers, for providers?
Yeah. So clearly Motif focused on mental health, treatment-resistant depression as their first use case. Many other BCIs, paralysis, ALS. Possibly one theory is it segments the market. To your point, it's very unlikely, given the scale of this the scale of the neuro issues BCI is attempting to address, there'll be one winner or even one or two winners, that this could segment on indication lines, a winner in mental health or, depression, paralysis, different hardware, software packages, integrations would be more suitable, for different challenges of the brain.
Yeah, think about pharma, right? The biopharma sector, if you think about market cap of large cap and small cap companies, is in the multiple trillions of dollars, right? So, and there's so many companies, and there's no reason why ultimately BCI companies will not be like that if we get to do what we're trying to do.
Yep. So last question on Motif, and again, we could go the whole interview on BCI Motif, but there's the material science view, there's the the TAM view, the go-to-market view, there's the reality of the game being played on the field. There are some extremely well-funded competitors in this broad space, and we can say, well, we're not all competing for the same pie, but longer term, potentially, Neuralink, Paradromics, Synchron. Every couple of weeks, there seems to be a BCI startup raising tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. How do you view the impact of capital as kind of defining the winners in this space? Because we are still in the early years.
Mm-hmm. In biotech, in general, across therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, you need money to validate your hypothesis, right? You need money to run the trials and show that whatever you're working on is safe and effective. And so the ability to fundraise is one of the considerations that we have for who we invest in, right? Especially because we invest so early, we need to take into account the science. We need to take into account the sort of reimbursement landscape and how to monetize these things. But we also need to consider, is this founder able to sell? And sell means different things. It means fundraising. It means recruiting the best people. It means partnering with pharma, with payers, with providers. And ultimately, it means selling your device to patients as well. And so the ability to sell is extremely important. And fundraising is part of that.
Sure.
One thing that's worth mentioning, and you mentioned Motif. When we were reviewing Motif, I remember this quote that we took from the CIA. We learned this from the CIA during the Cold War. So during the Cold War, the CIA had a set of criteria for what it would make an ideal spy. And they said that an ideal spy is a PhD that can win a bar fight.
Right.
And that's how we think about Jacob, the founder of Motif.
Right. Okay, 1 hour on the clock, Matias. 2 other portfolio companies I wanted to touch on, and maybe we do them together because they're both neuromodulation, both non-invasive, so we can continue the thematic about invasiveness versus efficacy. So one is Sanmai, focused ultrasound. Hat tip to Keith Murphy from Attune. We've had one podcast on the focused ultrasound markets. You've got a play in that game, and also Neurode, non-invasive neuro stimulation, EEG focused on ADHD. So maybe talk about each of those, taking different hardware and technology approaches to neuromodulation.
Yeah, I think people get a little bit lost with this divide between non-invasive and invasive. And the reality is that this is a lot more multidimensional than that, right? There could be non-invasive technologies that are the best, as I mentioned before, are the best tool for a specific use case. And there may be other invasive technologies that are the best tool for a specific use case. And this is the same, right? We're agnostic to invasive versus non-invasive. especially with things like ultrasound, where although it's non-invasive, it can access very, very deep brain regions. Sure. And unlike some invasive things, right, that are implanted at the supracortical or cortical level. So that's one key distinction, right? And then the second one is around consumer versus clinical applications. Ultimately, we believe that you can be successful in these two ways. And one way of thinking about it is that if you think about medtech, right, these VCs that have been investing in devices for decades now, and if you think about the two most exciting trends in devices in the past few years, I would argue these are brain-computer interfaces, and then consumer devices like Whoop and Aura Ring and many others, right? Like, Whoop and Aura, both $10+ billion companies, BCI companies also in the $1 billion valuations. These medtech investors, in general, they missed these two critical trends, right? Sure. And the reason for it is that they stayed too narrow in what used to be medical devices without thinking of, okay, what is the larger thing here? The larger thing is that our mission is investing in hardware that elevates human health. And if you take this broad approach, right, you stay more open to all the different opportunities and the paradigm shifts. And so for us, that's all we care about is, we have a very defined mission of supporting entrepreneurs that are elevating brain and mental health through frontier technologies.
Sure.
What that means in practice is very, very broad. And this spans across consumer and medical applications, invasive, non-invasive. And so we try not to get too bogged down with those distinctions.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting thematics there, Matias, that I think through Sanmai and Neurode, maybe you can give a little more color. One is the sort of wellness. What is a wellness device? What is a medical regulated device? What needs the FDA, where that line is? And to your point, Whoop and Aura showing huge market in wellness. But also, I guess, linked is channels like go-to-market, direct-to-consumer, removing friction, making these devices as accessible as possible in the home versus B2B2C, through clinics, clinicians, primary care, secondary care. So maybe just a little color using Sanmai and Neurode as examples of how you think about those topics.
Yeah, so Neurode is an example of a company that went direct to consumer first. And the obvious thing is that if you go direct to consumer and you don't go through an FDA path, there's certain claims that you cannot make, right? For example, Neurode doesn't say that the device works for ADHD, for example, because that would cross this line between consumer and medical. But they can say that this device helps with focus and attention, for example. And that resonates with a lot of people. We, especially in 2026, I think that most of us would benefit from a device that helps us not to scroll so much on social media or not to read so much of the news and just be focused. And so things like that. The danger with consumer devices and things like that is that it removes some of the burden of proof, and that could mean that there's less rigor. In the case of Neurode, and one of the reasons we invested is that that's not the case. They have run trials. They have very solid data. The stimulation patterns that, by the way, they're using FNIRS as an imaging technology, not EEG. So again, it's an orthogonal approach to how other consumer devices are going about it. And so the technology is supported by years and years of research, and they have actually run their own scientific studies as well.
Amazing. Look, final question, Matias. I could talk for hours about any of these companies or many of your other investee companies, but I want to be respectful of your time. you're very uniquely positioned to answer this one. There may be some entrepreneurial postdoctorate at Stanford or Kellogg or MIT, who knows where. They're seeing some amazing science. They're a budding entrepreneur. They're thinking of crossing the chasm and making the leap into entrepreneur land. What's the key takeaways you'd give them for how they should be thinking about that decision? And I guess back to where we began, how you would assess early stage kind of business thinking and business ideas. What advice would you give them?
Well, I would just warn them that it's so hard. It is so hard. What many people, when I say this, what many PhDs push, not just PhDs, but MDs and PhDs that have gone through both this journey of getting their graduate degrees, but also and postgraduate degrees, but also started companies, is that they push back and say, yeah, both things are really, really hard. So now the way I tell them is like, hey, this is at least as hard as getting a PhD or MD. So that's the first thing. Usually, the best entrepreneurs are people that they couldn't be doing anything else, right? Like they see this as their life mission, and they're doing it out of this desire to see something of their creation in the world, right? And I think that's a great driver. But ultimately, everyone has different fuels and different reasons why starting companies. So my advice is, hey, this is really, really, really tough. And so if you're signing up for this like decade-long journey, that's risky. There's a lot of uncertainty. And then you ask, how do we assess this? And it goes back to the basics, the PhD that can win a bar fight. That's what we look for. And those are the folks that are ultimately successful building companies in a biomedical field.
Yeah, that's great advice. It can seem glamorous from the outside, the world of Silicon Valley and startups, but it's hard yakka. It's a hard grind day to day. And to your point, you need to be high conviction before you leap into the arena. But Matias, thank you so much for joining the Business of Neurotech podcast, talking about the market, investing, some of your investee companies. I referenced one of your blog posts, which I will link in the show notes, about neurotech investing. But where else do you want to send people that might want to follow what you're writing about online and also the work of PsyMed?
We have a Substack, as you mentioned, where we post some of the things that we're thinking about. We also host a podcast. It's called Business Trip. That is at the intersection of mental health and startups. That's a great resource as well. And just want to say thank you, Adam, for hosting this space where we can advance knowledge.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, Matias. Great to have you on.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the show. For more information on the podcast, individual show notes, and all the links about where you can find the show, please visit businessofneurotech.com. We look forward to seeing you on a future episode.